Now, in the second part, we'll be looking into detail how is theory generated and what are the components of a theoretical framework. And we'll be looking into some of the research papers and see how they use theory to explain the relationship between a variable or variables. Now, how is theory generated? Having examined the different kinds of variables that we just did in part 1, that can operate in a situation and how the relationship among these variables can be established, it is now possible to see how we can develop the theoretical framework for our research. So having identified the different variables in our research and how the relationship between these variables is established, now we look into the details of theoretical framework, how we can develop the theoretical framework for our research. The theoretical framework is the foundation on which the entire research study or project is based. So if you've got a weak theoretical framework, you've got a weak research. It is logically developed, described, and elaborated network of associations among the variables deemed relevant to a problem situation. So what is theoretical framework? It has to be logically developed. It involves description and elaboration of the association between the variables that are part of your research problem. It becomes evident that at this stage, that to arrive at good solutions to the problem, one should first correctly identify the problem. Now, we have done this in previous sessions where we try to identify the problem, where we try to identify the issue, where we try to identify the variables that contribute to a problem. So the first thing is clear identification of the issue, of the problem that you want to study. And this will actually guide whole of your research. So if you fail to clearly identify a problem, then obviously your literature review, your development of theoretical framework, everything is weak. So after identifying the appropriate variable that will help you solve this particular problem, the next step is to elaborate the network of association among these variables. And once you identify the network of relationship among these variables, that is development of your theoretical framework, the next step is proposition of your hypothesis that are further or later tested. Based on the results of hypothesis testing, which indicates whether or not the proposed relationship or the proposed associations was significant or not, your problem can be solved or you draw results for your problem. The theoretical framework is thus an important step in the research process, a very important step, a key step. The relationship between the literature review and the theoretical framework. So what is the relationship between theoretical framework and literature review? Are these two the same thing? Or one is part of another? Or are they totally different? So the relationship between the literature review and the theoretical framework is that the former, the literature review, it provides solid foundation for developing the later, the theoretical framework. So once you are doing your literature review, what you are doing is that you are identifying the definition of variables that might be a key part of your theoretical framework. Or through your theoretical framework, you might be identifying the relationship between variables. That is another key part of theoretical framework. Or through your literature review, you might be identifying how and why these relationship exists, why these variables are interrelated with each other. That is another key part of your theoretical framework. So that is the literature review identifies the variables that might be important as determined by previous research findings. So now in our previous sessions, we have looked into detail how or what variables have been studied. What were the outcomes of those variables? And what did existing research propose for future research? What variables should be studied in limitations and future research directions? And based on that literature review, we identified that, okay, these are the variables that we should study in future. This in addition to the logical connection that can be conceptualized. While we are reading through our literature, the previous literature, we identify how 2 variables, 3 variables, 4 variables could be linked with each other. Now, this link is actually the basis of your theoretical framework. Now, the theoretical framework represents and elaborates the relationship among the variable. So what it does is it explains, elaborates the relationship between the variable. It explains the underlying theory that these relationships have, or the theory that could explain these relationships. And it will help you identify the nature and direction of the relationship. For instance, task conflict is one of the conflicts. So in general, we would say that, okay, task conflict or any form of conflict will have a negative impact on project success or business performance or team performance. But when you are reading the literature review, you come across these findings in existing literature that have mentioned that, okay, there are situations when a higher task conflict would actually be beneficial for the organization. It could help improve the chances of project success, or it could help improve team performance. So you get a clear picture of how and why variables are related with each other. And this actually gives you a more strong logical base for developing your testable hypothesis. So you know what the nature of variable is or variables is, and what is the direction of these relationships. Now, what are the components of a theoretical framework? A good theoretical framework identifies and defines the important variables that are relevant to the problem and subsequently describes and explains the interconnection of these variables. So, first thing, when you are proposing your theoretical framework in your research, so the first thing that you do is your theoretical framework is that you define the variables in your study. And then after that, once you have clearly conceptualized or operationalized your variable, what you do is, the next step is, how are these variables interconnected? The relationship among the independent variables, the dependent variables, and if applicable, the moderating and the mediating variables are elaborated. Should there be any moderating variable, it is important to explain how and what specific relationships they moderate. So if you've got any moderating variable, it might not be moderating all the relationships in your model. It might be moderating 1 or 2 relationships. So you need to clearly explain. An explanation of why they operate as moderators should be offered. If there are any mediating variable, a discussion on how or why they are treated as mediating variables is also necessary. It's important to note that a good theoretical framework is not necessarily a complex framework. So a good theoretical framework could be a very simple framework. For instance, just one independent variable, one mediating variable, one dependent variable. And there is a lot of research published in high impact journals, good journals, that have got these simple frameworks. So there are 3 basic features that should be incorporated in any theoretical framework. The first one, as described above, the variables considered relevant to the study should be clearly defined, elaborated, operationalized. The second thing, okay, I'll be showing you some research paper where you will see that, okay, this is how the theoretical framework is presented in a research paper. It is actually part of the literature review. Some people or some researchers give a section heading literature review and hypothesis development. Some say theoretical framework and hypothesis development. Some just write literature review. So we'll be looking into research papers and see where are these things in a research paper. So we clearly know this is how you present your theoretical framework. The second is a conceptual model. So what's the difference between a theoretical framework and a conceptual model? A conceptual model is part of your theoretical framework. And what it does is it describes the relationship between the variables in the model. And the third one is there should be a clear explanation. So once you define or once you describe the relationship, okay, these are the relationship that you are interested in identifying or explaining. The next part is why do you expect that these relationship would exist? And when you are defining or explaining this why, you use existing theory, existing literature as well. For example, I might use leader member exchange. So when, for example, if I'm interested in studying the impact of leadership on employee commitment, so I can use leader member exchange theory. So when there is the leadership is good within an organization, it's positive leadership. The leadership is helping the followers. In exchange for such leadership, there is a higher amount of commitment in employees. So there is an action and there is a reaction. So this is leader member exchange to a certain extent. So this theory, leader member exchange theory, has now helped me to explain how leadership could influence organizational commitment. Moving on. So now we'll explain these components in greater detail. So the first component is variable definition. It's not always easy in business research, in management related research, to come up with a generally agreed upon definition. There are maybe, if not hundreds, there may be tens of definitions for a particular concept. Now, more often than not, there are many definitions available in the literature. For instance, there are dozens of definitions available for brand image, customer satisfaction, service quality, corporate social responsibility, servant leadership, transformational leadership, transactional leadership, project success. Still, well-chosen guiding definitions of the concepts are needed. Now, you have to go through these definitions. What definitions are available? You have to look into detail as to what definitions are available. Now, once you do that, the next step is that it will help you explain the relationship between the variables in your model. What's more, they will also serve as a basis for the operationalization or measurement of your concepts. In the data collection stage of the research process, now, once you have clearly defined as to how you want to define a particular, or once you have clearly identified how you want to define a particular variable, this will help you how you are going to measure that particular variable. For instance, let's say you want to study social responsibility in a university. Now, there are definitions that say that, okay, social responsibility starts with economic responsibility of the organization, but or the profit side of an organization or corporation. But universities are not corporations. Universities, more or less, are in general not for profit entities. So you cannot use this conceptualization where the base of a corporation or an organization is profit making. So this definition is not actually applicable to a university. You need a definition that is applicable to your context. You need a definition that is applicable to what you are going to study, your unit of analysis. For instance, you are studying social responsibilities in responsibility in NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They are purely not for profit. So how can you have a definition that starts with profit making? That has start or roots in economic dimension. So hence you will have to choose a useful definition from the literature. And obviously do not use dictionary definition. They are generally or usually too general. So use specific, well-researched definition that are available. It is also important that you explain why you have chosen a particular definition. Why is this definition applicable? Why is this definition important? There are so many definitions. Might be because this is one of the latest definition. Might be because this definition is based on a study that has been conducted in your area of research. So it could be any reason, but it's always a good option to explain your reason. The second part is, after that you have defined what your variables are, the second part is conceptual model. A conceptual model helps you structure your discussion of the literature. A conceptual model describes your ideas, how the concepts variables in your model are related with each other. What are the relationships in your study? How are these variables related with each other? A part of conceptual framework is a schematic diagram of the conceptual model. Helps the reader to visualize the theorized relationship. You have seen these diagrams, you will see them in research paper as well. Hence, conceptual models are often expressed in this form. However, the relationship between variables can also be adequately expressed in words. So you give a schematic diagram and then you describe these relationships in words so that the reader could clearly comprehend and understand the theorized relationship. This facilitates and stimulates discussion about the relationship between the variables in your model. It is therefore important that your model is based on sound theory. You have to clearly identify the theory available in the existing research. You have to have sound reasoning through literature that why these relationships exist. Now, this is what the third part and the important part. Although the others are important as well. Now, I'm not saying that they are, obviously this is more important than others. They are equally important. One complements the other actually. So a theory, the next part is theory, explanation of relationship. A theory or a clear relationship or explanation for the relationships in your model is the last component of your theoretical framework. A theory attempts to explain the relationship between the variables in your model. Now, the theory will help you explain this relationship, why a certain variable is linked with other variable. By theory, it's not the word or the theory itself, for example, leader-member exchange theory or social identity theory. Here, the theory means existing literature as well. What is available in the literature? You have to use your reasoning. You have to identify what is available and why these relationships would exist. You might come across papers published in very good journals that you don't even use the word theory in the whole paper. So you might question, why is this paper published in such a good journal? So by theory, we mean the literature, the existing literature. If the nature and direction of the relationships can be theorized on the basis of the findings of previous research and on your own ideas on the subject, then there should also be an indication as to whether the relationship should be positive or negative. So you have to identify the direction of relationship and linearity or non-linearity. So we'll be discussing this in future lectures as well. And this is particularly related to data analysis. So from the theoretical framework, obviously the last step, as we have identified before, the last step is that you formulate your hypothesis. You express these relationships in the form of logically conjectured statement, that this is how these relationships exist. This is what you want to test in your study at the end of the theoretical framework. Now, the components of theoretical framework, note that you do not necessarily have to invent a new theory. You're not in the process of inventing a new theory. You just have to go to existing literature and search the existing literature for arguments as to why these relationships exist. And it's always a good idea, something very important, that you find a theory, an established theory that can help you explain why these relationships exist. Now, in basic research context, you will make some contribution to existing theories and models. Obviously, the prime importance, the prime reason that you are conducting basic research is obviously to contribute to existing theories and existing model, existing research. We have already discussed this in our previous sessions. In such a case, that is not always possible to use existing theories. You might not use this. This is what I've explained previously. Now, you might be testing a relationship that has not been tested before. You might be testing something that has not been elaborated before. So how would you test these relationships? Now, in this case, or in that particular case, you have to rely on your own insights. Use existing research to support your arguments. Okay, so what you do is, the next step is, okay, now I will show you some research paper that will guide you as to how you use theoretical framework, or where is this theoretical framework in these research papers. Now let's see, here are a few research papers. Okay, so let's say this paper. Okay, this is the introduction. And the next part, if you see, is your literature review and hypothesis development. Now here in literature review and hypothesis development, now this is where you define your theoretical framework, or you explain your theoretical framework. Now theoretical framework is guided by the literature review, as we have identified before. Now the first thing is that you define your variables, the concept. So here the first thing is that you are defining corporate social responsibility. What is corporate social responsibility? So the definition of variables. And the next thing is, once you have defined the variables, now in this case there is no separate section on each of the variable and definition separately. In this case, since it's a research paper, so definitions are part of when you are expressing the relationship between variables, and the conceptual model along with why these relationships exist are part of when you are expressing the relationship. So in the second component and the third component, and the first, second and third component might be mixed under a same, or under the same heading, in this case CSR and OP. Now if you look into, and let's write the word theory. So now how are you using a theory to explain the relationship between CSR and performance? Now in this case, the central idea in resource-based theory is that organizations compete against each other based on their resources and capabilities. Engaging in CSR signals a firm's unobserved characteristics, that is, superior resources and capabilities. CSR is identified as a critical firm resource. Now I am using, in this research, I'm using CSR, a resource-based view to explain the relationship between CSR and organizational performance. So that's the third part. Once you have identified the definition, once you have identified that, okay, CSR can be linked to organizational performance, the third part is using a theory, an established theory, to explain why these relationships exist. In this case, the authors have used resource-based view or resource-based theory. And this is how they have used to explain how CSR would impact organizational performance. Now this is how you use a theory. Similarly, there is another theory that is being used in this study. Now what is that theory? If you come down, so see here, team identification is the procedure by which individuals identify themselves in terms of attitude, goals, behaviors, and value. Now this is the definition part. So as I mentioned before, that you are explaining the definition, the description of relationships, and why these relationships exist under a similar heading. This is quite possible because in a research paper you do not have much space, so you have to merge these things. In thesis you do it separately, you can do it separately, but in a research paper you have to combine and put them all together. Now once this is defined, you are using a theory to explain that employee perception of CSR initiatives adopted by their employing organization strengthen their identification with the team and with the organization. Now this is the relationship that you want to check. This is your conceptual model. Now how does CSR help? This is where you explain how CSR helps. Now you are using social identity theory to explain these relationships. So all these three things that are part of the theoretical model are actually identified in this one single paragraph. So there is no need to provide separate headings, separate text for each one of them, because since it's a research paper, you combine all these things into a single, maybe single section. So this is what you see in most of the research papers. This is how they express the theoretical framework in the literature review section. Same is the case for this paper. What they have done is they have used knowledge-based view. I'll share these papers or the title of these papers that you can later download and use them, read them, how the authors have used the existing theories to explain the relationships. Furthermore, they also mention in the introduction what theoretical lens they are using. And within the contribution section, they also mention how these variables or how this particular study would contribute to existing research or existing theories. For instance, although the impact of servant leadership on career satisfaction is yet to be studied, leadership has been found to significantly impact career satisfaction. Hence, based on leader-member exchange theory, the study intends to ascertain the importance of servant leadership in shaping career and life satisfaction. Now, this is the contribution of this study to LMX, the leader-member exchange theory. So this is how you use, now here, see the theoretical framework. Now they have used the heading theoretical framework. In the other study, it was literature review and hypothesis development. Now the conceptualization, you first define the variables. The second part is, what's the research model? How are these relationships or how these relationships exist in existing research? Now see, they have used LMX to explain these relationships. So you go through these papers, you read these papers to help understand or develop an idea as to how theoretical framework is presented in a research paper. Thank you very much.